So with the slider in here, this is where we're going to go next. You can go find this up on GitHub. I'm being generous this time. Last time I gave you nothing on the endpoint and said if you want some code you have to go watch the video because I was mean. This time we're getting a starting point and an ending point. So it gives you a place to begin with this. So the starting point looks like this. It doesn't do anything. I click the buttons, nothing happens. We do notice that the buttons have some visual effects happening with those, and that's just through a little bit of CSS where you see the background start to change color a little bit, but it does it with a little bit of easing. It's not immediate. And these are some of those niceties that you can start to incorporate into your projects to make them more personal, more unique, and nicer to work with. So ugly pictures, make your own. Now when it's all put together and running with JavaScript, I can click on the buttons and we can see as I click on the buttons how it will cycle through and goes left for each click. I can click and now it's going to the right. And if you do nothing, it also incorporates a timer element, so then the timer fires off and every so often it will automatically advance to the next slide. So this is demonstrating the type of slider or slideshow image displays that we see permeating all over across the web, where it comes up, you see a nice big pretty picture. You may see some indication through dots or boxes or other things underneath it that tell you how many images are in that slideshow, so you can navigate or click to individual images, and then they self-run if you don't manually navigate through them. So these are some of the common characteristics that go into a slider or slideshow type of element that can be worked into a website to make it all nice and pretty. And that's really what we're going to start working on, is crafting one solution of this. This is not the only solution, it's not the best solution, it's not the cleanest solution, it's a solution. And I would challenge you to think about how could you come up with your own solution. How could you say, okay, here's the start, you start with the starting file, and you throw out all the code that's provided for functionality and you build your own. Try and do it through the magic of jQuery, straight JavaScript, a combination of the two, and play with it. What we're really doing here, on learn.jquery.com, if you go to effects, on the effects page, there's a really awesome thing, and it's called Custom Effects with Animate. And this is really what's going to be driving this whole project, is using the Animate feature. That's how we're able to get one slide to go on to the next. If we don't use Animate, it would just be you would click and it would automatically just, boom, we have the next image. And that's fine, but it doesn't have that same visual flow. It doesn't have that same nice experience component that really is something that works, I think, a lot better. So looking at custom effects with Animate, what we can see is you have the Animate function, and then you can just hard code something into it. You specify, or you can reference a function. So you could put a function call. So if you define a function, such as like move left, move right, hint, hint, that's what will be in the slideshow. And then we can specify durations, and then we can have secondary functions that get called when that animation has completed. So it's a pretty powerful kind of entity that we can work with. We also have the option to incorporate easing into it. So this is similar to working with some of the CSS animations that you're able to do. It uses a similar kind of syntax to make that happen. When working with jQuery, one of the things you can do is you can download the most current file from jQuery.com. Thought it was .org, but .com. So jQuery.com, you can go download the most current file. But in the file I put on GitHub and the one that then we're referencing, I noticed it was not the most current version. Now there's another option that we can work with, and we can actually then start just referencing it, where we can put a link to then the most current jQuery file, so that you can just put a line in like this into your code, and that will now give you, that's now linking to the most current file of jQuery. And now it's broken. Oh. Do you ever have where when you paste a link off of Google and then or off a web page and then it doesn't copy the HTTP part? Yeah. Only changing opacity and it's not animating. So if I look at this, we can see it fades out. If I pull up the console, it logs that out when it's done. So refresh the page, we can see that happens. But it does not, and I can even slow it down to 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. So if we make it take longer to happen, but it's not moving its position. One of the things to remember when we are trying to animate things, if we are changing their positions on screen, we have to style them, because the first few times I ran this, it only changed the opacity because no style information was applied to that div. Now this is an important concept. It's a CSS concept, but because we're using JavaScript, or in this case jQuery, which is JavaScript. jQuery is JavaScript. It's just a library of helper functions to allow you to do things faster, so you don't have to hard code all of it yourself. That's why we can just say animate. It expects some different things, and it gives us the results, and it works beautiful. So jQuery is just a way to speed up our use of JavaScript. But in this case, if we want something to move on screen, we have to set its position information. And we usually are going to use something like absolute, so that once something has been positioned absolutely on the page, we've now determined it is at this location. So then we can now move it from that location. If we have not positioned an element, we can call out position information, left, right, top, bottom, to our heart's content, and nothing happens. So it's important to always keep that little point in mind, that we have to position things in CSS before we can modify their position properties with JavaScript. Though it may not appear on first glance to be a very complex file, we're changing multiple CSS properties of the object. We're changing its position. We're changing its opacity. We're doing it across time. Now it's not happening based on a click event. It's happening just as the document loads. So we're not triggering this off something. So we will be attaching our jQuery to buttons, so that when we click on those, then that will call the functions that will then animate our pictures across the screen. But remembering what we need to do with the CSS and understanding a little bit about how this is happening. Animate is now performing this operation over a duration of time, and when it's done, it gets to call a different function. And we're going to be taking advantage of that when we try and build the slideshow, because the slideshow is going to do a couple of different things. We'll see a slide. That slide's going to move, but then we need to take the slide that's on the end of the line and move it back to the beginning of the line, because otherwise we're going to run the slideshow a few times, and then pretty soon there will be an empty picture. So we want to create this illusion of a perpetual loop. So if I go in one direction where we have 3 slides, I start out on the left one, and then if I move over, it actually puts the right one next to it, so that then it pulls that into position. And then when I go to the next one, it grabs the one that's on the end and puts it back at the beginning. So it just creates this kind of leapfrogging where the one on the end goes back to the beginning. Or if I go in the other direction, the one on the beginning goes back to the end. So it creates a perpetual movement of the pictures. So when we look at that in action again, so we have 3 pictures, but if I'm looking at the first picture, when that one's, if it slides to the right, I need to then reveal the 3rd picture. And then when that picture slides to the right, it's going to reveal, let's see which one. So we have, I don't think, there's the first picture. So we can see that was the first picture. And then it's going to slide and reveal the next picture. And now as it slides, you're going to see it reveals the third picture. And as the third picture slides, it's actually going to pull into view the first picture again. Because what it's done is it now takes the one on the end and moves it over to the beginning. So it's actually changing the HTML or the markup that is on screen the entire time. So if we look at the source code and see what is happening, so if we watch the three, so we have phase 3, phase, and phase 2. Now we have phase, phase 2, and then that would be phase 3. And then we'll see it switches again. So it's taking the one on the end of the line and it's moving. So it's actually changing the HTML, which is really cool as it makes that happen. So when we look at this, all three pictures are on screen. But we're using CSS to limit which ones are currently visible. Oh no, that's not it. The slider finish. So if we look at how this is constructed, where's the HTML? There it is. There's the slider div. Inside of that are two links for our buttons. And don't be disturbed by the extra brackets here. Those are just the controls on the buttons. I probably should replace those with their kind of their kind of markup character instead of just the brackets, but it didn't break my code, so I let it go. But we could replace those with an image. You could replace it with a word. You could replace it with whatever makes you happy. So if I wanted to replace this with let's see, next here, previous there. So we can see next and previous. If that makes a person happier than seeing those extra carrots in the code going, whoa, that looks like broken markup. And well, yeah, it kind of does. We could use the ampersand blah 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 4-character representation to go find what those angle characters are. Escape characters. So if we do, all right, that didn't work. So these are HTML escape characters. And now let's see if this list gives us what we want. So if I want to represent these, then we just type in these ampersand, pound sign, and a couple, or hashtag in the world of Twitter. So now we have to go through and find where is that symbol, or that caret. And it's going to be somewhere in the list. So using the escape characters greater than and less than, it now makes prettier looking code, and it should have been done that way in the first place, but whatever. It is what it is. But by watching the code, we can see how that animation is taking place over time. So it's being called to animate. And if you notice when I'm on the UL, it's highlighting it in blue, so we can kind of see how the entire div is moving, even though the overflow of the slider div is set to hidden. So the slider is set to be the visible area of where the center picture is, but the unordered list, which is the group of pictures, you can see how it's now sliding across as this animates. So I think this creates a pretty nice visual so you can see what is actually happening in this particular instance. So the left position of this element, going back to that animation file previously, doing that little animation where we changed the left of that object. In that case, we made it go 500 to the right. This time we are now animating it 360 pixels negatively or to the left when it's auto running. If I go here, we'll we'll see it should. Come on. There we go. Now it's caught up. Now we can see it goes to 360 and then it wanted to go back. Looking at the starting slider, the key part is, let's prettify this a little bit, get some better indents going. Oh, except now this really doesn't like that. Greater than, less than, let's fix those. Now the good part is all of this will be a little bit later. When it's pushed back up on GitHub, then it will have the completed code with any changes or cleanups that happen in class. So you'll have that to go. So we have the div, which we're calling slider, links for the buttons, an unordered list that contains the pictures. Getting through the CSS of just this core part in the beginning, I think, is important. Once we understand how some of that's functioning, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. So we can see here is the slider. The slider doesn't move. The slider ends up sitting on screen and it doesn't move. But the unordered list inside slider is going to start moving. And then the list items, those pictures, are told to float left, which is why they all stack up against their left-hand side. We could probably also use the display inline or something like that, but when we're changing their positions, I've always had better luck when I'm moving things around if I'm moving blocks around than things that are inline. And the buttons, the controls, well, notice that they get a z-index of 999, because even though they show up first in the code, they sit on top. And that's what z-index does. Z-index sticks things on top of each other. So think of z-index is the shuffling of the cards in a deck. The higher the number, the closer it is to being on top. If something has a low number, it's going to be on the bottom. If you don't specify z-index of your elements, they are then in the order that they show up on screen. So in this case, this would be within the slider. This has position of 1, this is now 2, and then the list is 3. Then within the list we have 1, 2, 3. So technically the pictures would be on top of the controls, but through z-index we can stick them on top. Don't have to do it that way, but it's just a way of becoming aware of how some of these things function. The buttons have the transition for opacity on so that they give us a little bit of prettiness to make some fun happen. All right. Now, if we go and start comparing before and after, we're not going, between this one and this one, we're not going to see a whole lot of any difference. Except that this one hasn't been made pretty yet. So if we compare, we'll see that the two are virtually identical as you work your way through the CSS. So what that does is that tells us that the real changes that have occurred are going to be in the JavaScript, are not going to be in the CSS. So the CSS is done. What we need to work with on the JavaScript is to start to figure out what is happening with our slider. And the main technique that is being used is the same thing that we looked at in the animation file. We're animating the left position of an object, and then we're doing a little extra fun here that jQuery is really good at doing. jQuery is awesome at selecting objects and then modifying your markup and modifying the properties of the objects that are selected. That's what jQuery is really, really good at doing. So if you remember when we watched the code in the console, we saw that it was changing which list item was where in that list, because it starts out where you have face, face 2, face 3. And then when it would animate, it would take face 3 and put face 3 in front of face. So then you had face 3, face, face 2. And then it would take face 2, move that in front of, and that would be prepend, move it to the beginning of the list, where append moves something to the end of the list. And this is part of moving left and moving right, as we will start to figure out what is happening with that. Because if we're moving left, we're moving in the direction that I'm highlighting here. So you're moving an object to the left. If you move it to the left, you grab what's at the end of the line and you move it or prepend it back to the beginning. So you grab the last element and then you stick it to the beginning. But if we're moving to the right, so that we're now using a negative value, then what we're going to do is grab the first item in our list and append or stick it on the end of slider. So remembering we have 3, 1, 2, 3. So prepend would be grab the item at the end, move it to the beginning. Append would be grab the item at the beginning and move it to the end. So the same change that I just made by hand, dragging my code, that's what's actually happening with our jQuery animate function. Is it animates and then it grabs that last item or the first item and moves it. And then it resets the CSS of that slider element back to 0 effectively, so that it's ready to animate again. And this is part of how it creates a perpetual loop animation. And when we start playing with some of these numbers here and get a little sense of it, we'll be like, oh, that's what's going on. And it'll start to make more sense. Don't worry about the reset timer stuff right now. I'm actually just going to comment all of that out. So the whole thing will only move if we click a button. Length is going to be how many elements are in our slider. We can see that works out to be 1, 2, 3 in this instance. So jQuery can just tell us how many elements are there. It's just like using length with an array when we're doing other programming. Width, it's now querying and saying how big is that li object, or how tall is that li object. And if we look up under the li, we will see height and width have been set respectively. Now, it's useful to have access to that, because when we do that, we're able to now work with this, because by knowing the sizes, then when we're trying to animate and also position things on screen, we have a little more control over how we are going about doing that. Let's see. Now, the slider itself is currently being centered on our screen by using the auto method. So it's using a top margin of 20, left of auto, bottom of 0, and a right of auto. Top right auto, then bottom, then left. So TRBL for the margin for the slider. So the slider div itself is being put centered on screen using the margin auto method. So that's just one of the CSS hacks we can use to center elements when we position them on screen. So you're setting the margin of that element. That one thing about that is when we are trying to set the margin of a particular element that way, it usually is going to be useful for it to now have a specific size, which we are then setting through the JavaScript here. To position an element and center it on screen, it needs to have a width value assigned. But we didn't assign that width value in the CSS initially because we want that width to be based on the size of the list elements that are going to be showing up on screen. That's why there isn't a width value previously assigned to it. It's also important to realize that we don't set the CSS property until we know what these values are. And all of this is, of course, using the document ready function of jQuery. So we do the document ready function, and then we do all of our movie magic and make things happen. We figure out what these variables are. Then we start assigning some CSS. So we put the position of the slider, so we set its width and height. Then we take the unordered list inside that slider, and we set its width and we set its margin. Now we end up using this margin at a negative value to begin with, and if we don't do that and comment it out, we get some interesting things happening on screen. So we can take a look at that to start to understand how this whole thing happens and how it comes together. So we will work with that in just a little bit. Now it also, because it's showing the first child in the list, so when it loads it shows the unnumbered face. It is then going to grab face 3. It will grab this and it moves that over to here as its first order of operation. And it does that so that if someone were to hit the left button, or I mean the right button, if someone hits the right button, so it moves the images to the right, we would need to have something there. If we don't do that, I comment that out and we look at this. Now if I hit this button, oops, sorry, wrong one. Let's hit this one. All right, now it's behaving. Now I actually did break the code. I commented out 2 lines of code on here, because if we don't have these lines of code on here, so if we just set the width of this and don't originally adjust the margin of it, right now we have the face. So it starts out and it looks at this face here, and that is now face without a number. It's face without a number. Now if I hit this button here, we'll notice there was nothing at the end as it slid across, and now it is giving us that third face. Because what we need to happen is when the document loads, we need this third image here to go to the beginning. So keep in mind, this is face no number, this is face 2, this is face 3. So when the document loads, if we look at it, now if I hit this and it shifts, we see there's nothing there. So by having it say, okay, I want to have this document to the, or that a copy of that picture, we'll move that over to the side, then it now gives that to me so that I can look at it. But when I do that, if I just do that, if we load, now we can see, wait, it's still not working right. Because what needs to happen with it is we want it to show the third one. So we're on this picture. We put a copy of this picture off to the left. But that means then when we're looking at the slider, we would see this picture. But we don't want to see that picture first. We want to see the first picture, the one with the hand. So then we shift everything over to the left. So these two statements end up working in conjunction with each other, because without them. And this is discovered through a process of trial and error. Is get the picture showing up, push the buttons, the pictures move. And then you're like, oh crap, there's nothing there. Because if I look at it this way, so if we save it, go back to the slider image. If if I go here, I'm like, okay, that works. It shows me the next picture. Shows me the next picture. Okay, everything's good. And it's, whoops. No, it's not. Because there's nothing to the left. And this is where it gets to be a little bit of mental gymnastics, is I want to start with this picture, and I always want something to be on the side over here. So we need a picture over here. So that every time I slide things over, it's going to reveal something. Otherwise, it will slide over and then it will pop it up and go, oh, wait, we now need to show you that next picture. Then we move it in screen. But if we don't, if we're now looking, in essence, at the left picture, there's nothing to the left if we haven't put it there. If we were to automatic or be starting out and look at the middle picture, so I could go left or right, and then started making pictures leapfrog, then we would have no issues. But because we're starting out with the first picture, which I think, you know, makes sense that you should do, we have to kind of prepare ourselves by saying, all right, well, if I'm going to look at the first picture and then I hit the button that will reveal what's hidden to the left, we need to move the third picture over, or the final picture over. But then by moving that picture over, it now, by moving this over, that changes what is the leftmost picture. So then we have to slide the whole slider list to the left. Actually, let's go here. Oh. Wrong button. So we can see how it goes from 0 to 360 with its left position, and then we end up with a picture at the end. Which, if go here, I'm just going to put the timer back on real quick so that I can keep my mouse over the highlight section so we can see it. Ooh. Can I? No, it's not. It's going the wrong way. There we go. So we can see how the whole slider moves off to the right-hand side of the screen. Apparently in my timer. Missed one of the timers? Over. But if we now move that over, now we can see how it moves that way, and then the picture lined up. But we need to get a picture over there to work with. So we start with our first picture. Because if we just have the negative width, when it loads, we're now on picture 2. That is picture 2, not the first picture. Then it works and reveals picture 1. But now we can see we're on picture 1, revealing picture 3. I'm back to see picture 1. I'm going to just tweak this a little bit and just say move or reset timer here. If I can type. Call the reset timer. So now when it's moving, we're seeing it correctly. We'll see the div. There's the div. We can see now it moves over. Whoa, because we had some of that stuff commented out. And now it will go all the way over because there's nothing to the left because we haven't shifted our position over. This is one of those, if the timer was animating it to the other direction, because then there's more pictures in that direction, we wouldn't even know it was broken until we clicked the button a few times and went, oh crap, that's not working right. So this is one of those, once we stick that element over there, and now look at it, now we will get to see, or not, oh, and shift it over. Because it's a two-step process. We have to do both of those things to make this happen. And this is just part of the fun, and I'm putting very deliberate air quotes around the word fun of dealing with CSS and positioning. This is also one of those things that helps you to understand when you are working with JavaScript, you're always going to be working with the markup and the style information of your web page. That's just an integrated part of doing JavaScript. So we can do hardcore programming things with it, but remember the bulk of front-end web design and JavaScript is about using the JavaScript to now control or manipulate or modify the CSS or the HTML of what we're seeing on screen. So now we can see how those values are changing. We can see the blue representing that div as it animates itself across the screen, creating our movie magic. Now, the buttons have a click behavior, a jQuery click behavior attached to them. So it says, give me an anchor link which has the style of control previous and control next. We can see, if we look through our code, there's an anchor link that has a class of control next. There's an anchor link with a class of control previous. So that's there using the jQuery click method. It calls the function which then itself calls move left and move right. So this is just an anonymous function that calls two other functions. It calls move left to make it go, and then it's calling the reset timer. Now, we could integrate the reset timer so reset timer doesn't get called until after the animation is done, and we could put it up here as well, and then it would just be part of move left and move right. That would probably make more sense. The timer was a later addition to this project as it developed, which is why it's not as integrated into the rest of it, so it's kept a little bit different or separate. Now, reset timer is using a set timeout method. Now, we have not talked about JavaScript timers in here before, and there are 3 different ways to do timer-based events in JavaScript. There is a set timeout, which is a timer that fires off once. So when it's done, it says, boom, do something. There is set interval, which will then keep firing off and doing whatever you ask to happen during that interval at whatever frequency you tell it. And the final method is request animation frame. Request animation frame is the new kid on the block. Later on this semester, we will take a look at the 3 different timer objects or methods in JavaScript and how we can use them to our purposes. But right now, set timeout is just simply, it's like setting a countdown timer. And you say, when it's done, I want something to happen. the time that it takes is measured in milliseconds, so 5,000 would be 5 seconds. If you wanted it longer or shorter, you change that number. All of these sorts of things are, when you see a number value like that, change it and see how it works with your code. And go, hey, does this work? Now, if you made this 5,000 less than 2,000, you'd have a problem because it takes 2 seconds for the slide to animate across the screen. And if you said, I want the timer to fire off so that it tries to move before that's done, then you're going to cause a log jam and it will be ugly. Now, if you want the slides to animate faster, say I want them to go in ½ second, like that. So now when it animates, we can see it's snappier. So you can go snappy, you can go slow. If you want the timer to fire off, so if we want them to go really fast, we'll do 50 milliseconds here, and then make this go every 100. So we can see it's really starting to go. To the point that it was going one way and now it looks like it's going the other way, which is kind of fun.